so I think we can get started.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, so I've actually experimented a little bit in the past couple of weeks with, what's the right word? Taking taking off screen share so we have a bigger view of each other. But actually, this works pretty well, I think. Does it not? Just I can see all of you. Can you guys see each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm reminding myself of I think I told you the story about my mom and email. Did I tell you that story?
I don't think so.
When so I don't know, 20 years ago, my siblings and I bought my parents a computer and access to the internet.
Yeah.
And the first email I ever got from my mom, I was sitting in my office in Chicago, and there's an email from my mom. So I open it up, and it says this: "Hi, little Davy, period. Print this out and mail it back to me so I know you got it." So, but I'm well aware that I've reached that same spot, but my own ability to understand what's going on with technology. So I think, so last week, I think we ended right at the point of Paul being a Roman citizen and beginning that discussion. And I think where we're going to get tonight is we're going to get through that, and we're going to begin looking at, if not deal with, probably most of the timeline of Paul's life and ministry. And then I think the last two sessions will be talking big picture Paul's theology. I think we said life and I think we said life and theology. Did we not, Jenny? Yeah. So that's where we're where I'm planning to go. So tell me if this is not about where we ended. I think this is where we ended last time. So he was a Roman citizen. Does this slide look familiar?
Not to me.
Okay. So what does it mean that he was a Roman citizen? It actually means he's a citizen of the city of Rome. So the Roman Empire, it was as if Stockton had conquered all of North America and Central America and South America and ran the whole thing through the Stockton city government. So, 201, actually, the Battle of Zama, and the Romans defeated the Carthaginians. And from that point on, they controlled everything in the Mediterranean, from Italy to Spain, and then all of North Africa. And then within 50, 60 years, they conquered all of Greece. And this is before there was an emperor. This is when it was still run by the Senate. And the Senate was originally just a city government, like the wealthy people who run the city. And so the empire was, like I said, like as if Stockton conquered the whole of the Americas and ran the whole thing through their city government. And so what that meant is to be a Roman citizen was technically to be a citizen of the city of Rome. And even when they conquered other parts of Italy, they didn't automatically give citizenship to the people they conquered. They had this kind of elaborate system of gradations of benefits of citizenship. So they were Italian citizens. So if you were at least from Italy and they conquered you, you would have you wouldn't have Roman citizenship, but you'd have Italian rights, they called it. And then if you were, then they had lesser degrees of rights if you were farther away from the homeland. Now Augustus is the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and there's this long sort of political military equivalent of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation Battle Royale that lasts until 30 or so BC, and this guy who comes to be known as Augustus, he's the last one standing, and with him we say the empire begins, and it wasn't like he didn't declare it; he acted like the republic still existed. But he controlled everything, and everybody knew that's exactly what was going on. And under Augustus, and for the first 100 years or so, citizenship was gradually granted to more and more people, but it was still pretty rare in the first century. By 212, the Edict of Caracalla, that edict makes everybody a citizen. And from that point on, people are trying to get out of being a citizen because being a citizen meant you were on the tax rolls. And so finally, by the late 300s, there are plenty of evidence of people who frankly just say, I'm trying to move out so I can get out from under taxation. So in Paul's day, it was exceedingly rare for a Jew to be a Roman citizen. So we read about this, his citizenship in two places in Acts. So Acts 16, you may remember, in jail in Philippi, when it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jailer with the order, release those guys. The jailer told Paul, you can leave, go in peace. Paul said, forget that. They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and they threw us into prison. And now they want to get rid of us quietly. No, we demand that they come and themselves and escort us out. And when the city magistrates heard this, they were alarmed, because they could be criminally culpable for punishing Roman citizens without a trial. And then there's, you may remember this in Acts 22. The crowd listened to Paul. This is in the temple precincts. Then they raised their voices and shouted, get rid of him. He's not fit to live. And they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air. And the commander ordered that Paul be taken to the barracks. He directed he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. So they brought him all the way to the prison, to the torture room. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, is it legal for you to flog a citizen who's never even been found guilty? And the centurion heard this. He went to the commander and said, what are we going to do? He's a Roman citizen. They asked him, are you? He said, yep. And the commander said, wow, I had to pay a lot to be for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen, Paul replied. So let's talk about that for a little while. So first of all, this is early, this is the 50s maybe AD, and Roman citizenship was still really rare. So much so that the authorities didn't even think about the possibility that someone was a Jew, might actually be a Roman citizen. And you could, if you were under certain conditions, you could get citizenship, you could pay for it. Like the centurion, he's already been in the army a little while. And normally, if you serve a whole 20-year stint in the army, and as a legionnaire, and the difference between a legionnaire and an auxiliary is a legionnaire, you're actually in we would say the national military establishment. Auxiliaries are usually folks who are from the whatever province your military unit is in, and they wouldn't technically be soldiers of the Roman state. They'd be technically soldiers of whatever local militia there is. But at the end of that service of 20 years, you would often get citizenship, and they sometimes founded colonies. So actually, when Corinth was refounded, was destroyed by the Romans at 146 BC and recolonized in 44. It was colonized at least partially with retired Roman soldiers. So you would get citizenship automatically at the end of your terms of service. But this guy was a centurion. He's still in the army, and so he's done something to speed up the process. He's paid a little money for it. It would have happened anyway, generally, but he's paid some money. But Paul says, I was born a citizen. Well, how did that happen? So almost certainly the way that happened is some ancestor of Paul's had done something of service to the Roman state. And usually that would be military service. So I can see David there on the, in the screen. So if David were a military, Roman military general, or even a procurator, he could, by his own authority in that role, bestow citizenship, full citizenship, on anyone he chose. He would have to defend it on, what did this person do? And usually it was somebody someone had done some service to the Roman military machine. And so we don't know who in Paul's family, his dad, his grandfather, or great-great-great-grandfather, but somebody in Paul's family tree, male family tree, patrimony, had done something to service to the Roman state. And so Paul inherited citizenship. So that's pretty extraordinary. And even the commander would be, kind of impressed that he got citizenship that under those conditions. So a little else about what that might mean. So it's incredibly rare. Like I said, non-Italians had to serve in the army for 20 years. We don't know how, but it would be granted by a general. So think about this guy, Flavius Josephus. So he is this famous historian. He was a general in the Jewish War of 66-70 AD, the one which ended in the temple being destroyed. He was from Galilee, actually, the region around Galilee. And he was captured very early in the war, and the Romans used him as an agent to try to negotiate with the Jewish forces. And he spent his career, in essence, trying to explain Rome to the Jews and Jews to the Romans. And he's called Flavius Josephus. So his Jewish name is Josephus, but he was adopted by the general Vespasian of that war, the Roman general, who then halfway through the war became the next emperor. So Vespasian is the founder of the Flavian dynasty. So when Nero died 68, it's called the Year of the Four Emperors. There were 3 other pretenders who tried to make themselves emperor. Some lasted only a couple months. Vespasian, when he heard that Nero had died, he first went to Egypt, waited for calmer weather, and then took a ship to Rome, and he established his Flavian dynasty. So that's how Josephus got the name Flavius. Now that, like we would say, that's a kind of funny way to get your first name. Josephus is how he's known, but he's got this first name he's known to history as Flavius. So what's that all about? Yeah, I said those things. So Roman names had for centuries consisted of 2 parts, praenomen and nomen. The first is what we would call the given name, the second, the clan name. So the praenomen, like my praenomen would be David. That's my name, it's my first name, we would say. And the family name is Nystrom. So praenomen, nomen. The deal with Latin names, Roman names, though, is they only have like 6 or 7 first names. So there'd be tons of David Nystroms running around. Just imagine that. That's horrifying. But it got to be really hard then. I mean, Caesar's name is Gaius Julius Caesar. That's his full name. So Gaius is his first name, but there are tons of people named Gaius. Julius is his family name. And so what happened beginning about 100 years or so before Jesus was born, the Romans started using a third name, the praenomen, nomen, and then cognomen, which would be that one that would be that apply to just one person. So Gaius Julius Caesar, Caesar is not the family name like Swenson, or Smith or something. Caesar is the name that applies just to this one guy, Gaius Julius Caesar. So that then, however, became the name, sort of the name or the title for this person of surpassing power in the Roman system. So that means Paul almost certainly, when he was born, would have been given a Roman name. Now, we don't know, like Flavius Josephus, we know he was adopted by the Flavian, somebody of the Flavian clan. We don't know the name of the nomen of his Latin name. So we don't know who felt that Paul's ancestor had done something so wonderful that he granted citizenship. What we know is we have Paul's, almost certainly Paulus would have been the name given to Paul at birth as his praenomen. And then there would have been some Latin name, and then his cognomen that would set him apart from everybody else was almost certainly his Jewish name, Saul. Does that make sense? So, I mean, I grew up thinking, and even in confirmation probably was taught, that when Paul became a Christian, his name changed from Saul to Paul. That probably isn't what really happened. He probably had both names his whole life, and he used Saul when he's in a Jewish context and Paul when he's in a more polyglot Roman context. I was been very excited all week to explain that to you. That I don't know why, but I was. Any questions about that or comments?
David, I was curious if there was some sort of proof of citizenship, sort of like a passport or something. Why would the centurion believe Paul when he said he was a citizen? Was there something to show?
That's a great question, because they didn't have like an ID card, a California Real ID, unlike they don't have they didn't have a DMV to go to wait in lines. That wasn't nice. Now they did have there were actual documents, and they were usually metallic. So there'd be some kind of plate you could have where you could, in fact, prove it. But obviously you didn't carry that around with you in your wallet. A similar case is household slaves sometimes were sent by their owners even far away, hundreds of miles away. And how would you be able to prove, that you were, that you weren't a runaway? So there were travel documents, perhaps, on parchment or something like that, with a signet ring stamp. But I think the basic answer is someone who pretended, who lied, and then it was found out they weren't. The penalty would be very severe. So I think it was the threat of a very severe penalty. But what is startling is he claims it, and people are surprised, but they don't. According to Acts, they don't say prove it. Yeah. I mean, I think in our culture, you have to, when, depending on what you're buying, you have to prove you're who you say you are, that you're a certain age. So that's an area where actually it'd be really interesting. It's hard to find out more. You know, think about all the things in our life that we just take for granted. Very simple, everyday things. Like, you know, how do we buy gasoline? That probably people, you know, 300 years from now will have no idea, because we don't write that stuff down in our, you know, in our diaries or something like that. So there's an awful lot about the ancient world that's the stuff of everyday life we just have no clue about, because it wasn't worth commenting on for people.
So David, if Paul's called to change his name from Saul to Paul, representative of his ministry to the Gentiles, the reason for then the name Paul?
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, if he's traveling in elsewhere in the Roman Empire, anywhere besides Judea, it would just make sense for him to use the name Paul. He's speaking Greek, not Hebrew in that kind of context. I think, you know, most of the population, most Jews, if they're living in Judea, they don't speak Greek. If you're living somewhere else, of course, anywhere else, of course, you do. And for him to have a Latin name, Paulus, that would, you know, that would say something. Yeah, sometimes when I'm introduced or people meet me and they find out I'm a doctor, they are, you know, they are mistakenly overimpressed and maybe cut me a little slack or something. They think I'm a surgeon, and when they find out that I just know a lot about stuff that most people don't care about, then they change their opinion. But anyway, I think that would be a benefit to him. To be identified as Paul. Now,
So Paulus to Paul, is that similar to David to Dave?
Yeah, Paulus is the Latinized name. Nobody called him Paul. That's our anglicized equivalent to Paulus. I'm saying nobody called him Paul. We don't actually know. You know, we don't have recordings, but his name would have been Paulus. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think so. I mean, this would be entirely logical and consistent with what we know about other similar cases, of which there aren't a whole lot from the ancient world. So, yeah, I think I already said all that. So it could be pretty confusing if you have a limited number of first names. So Paulus was his Roman name. His Jewish name was Saul. Now, he's a Pharisee. So what does that mean? You know, there are these, you've probably seen this division, that there are 4 groups within first century Palestinian society: the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and the Pharisees. Now, most people didn't belong to any of these. Most people, so it's really a 5th group, which would be the vast majority of the population, are sometimes called in Aramaic the Anawim, which means the people of the land. So in the ancient world, of course, I think I've mentioned this, it's an incredibly steep socioeconomic pyramid where something like, I'm going to say 90 to 95% of the population lived at their equivalent of the poverty line or you know, below the poverty line. And we see that frequently in the Gospels. So the folks that are mentioned in these 4 categories are either somewhat wealthy or for whatever reason, by dint of their own energy or something else, they have risen to some kind of prominence. So the Sadducees are connected with the priestly class, and I think I may have mentioned this last week, but we have to get out of our minds thinking of priests the equivalent of modern day pastors or ministers. Priests have that role by birth, their heredity, and their job really is to take care of the mechanics of sacrifice. So it's a little bit different than like someone who works in the sacristy of a Roman Catholic church, or someone whose job is to take care of the elements, etc. Because there are some features where they're actually performing the sacrifice Day of Atonement, but every day there is sacrifices in the morning and the afternoon. So someone's got to be there to actually take the animals, inspect them, kill them, and then cut them up and put the right parts on the altar. So that's what priests do. They only by accident perhaps get very interested in actually teaching about what it means to live the religion. What we would say is live the religion out. And the folks who were concerned about that were a group called the Pharisees, probably from paros, meaning the pure ones. And so these are folks, I mean, an analog for us might be folks who get, very interested in exploring this, Christians who get very interested in exploring the spiritual life. So they go to, they watch Henry Nouwen videos a lot, they're Stephen ministers, and they go to retreats. So they were very concerned about how to live our lives in such a way that we're living in a way that's pleasing to God. And they almost certainly, this is what Jacob Neusner is a name you might have come across, but beginning about 30 years ago or so, he became pretty well known in New Testament circles for publishing in New Testament journals and telling all the Christians how they were wrong about first century Jews. And quite brilliant, quite caustic as a writer. But he argues that what Pharisees, he pointed out that there are like heave offerings are meals, food that priests would consume that are above common food, but they're not unclean. So there's unclean, and then there's clean, and clean can be common, that's the lowest heave offering, which is food for the priests, and then the highest level is what can be sacrificed on the altar. And so it's likely that Pharisees are people who ate common food as if it were pure, had the purity of a heave offering. So that is, they wanted to live their lives in such a way that they focused very much on how do we live in a way that's actually pleasing to God. So this might be a little alarming, but an imperfect analog is they're a little like evangelical Christians. I mean, they're the ones they're really trying to think, what does God really want from us? And they're the ones almost certainly who develop this elaborate system of what we would call law, that comes to be called the Mishnah, written down maybe around 200. And so the story, for instance, of the Good Samaritan, right? Why do the priest and the Levite see him when he's left for dead? They don't even go to inspect. Well, that's because there was oral law that said, here's how you stay pure. If there's a dead body, you don't touch it, because if you touch a dead body, you're unclean for a week. And if your shadow falls across it, you're unclean for a day. So the principle underneath it is, how do you stay pure? And what makes you impure? Dead bodies, flow of blood, sexual fluids, and leprosy. You come into contact with any of those, that conveys impurity. That's biblical. Now, the Pharisees said, okay, let's try to figure out how then we build a system around it. How do we negotiate with that? How do we how do we keep ourselves pure? And so their intention was to live in such a way that they lived in such a way their lives were always pleasing to God. Now Jesus is going to attack them, not for their intent to live pure lives, but essentially because they have elevated rules so to such an extent that they have in effect forgotten the principles the rules are supposed to defend. So think about speed limit. Don't go faster than 35. I'm sure there are speed limits in Napa that are on some of those roads that are 35 miles an hour. But if one of those fires is chasing you, and you're only going 35 miles an hour, and there's a whole line of cars behind you, you may be obeying the law, but you're missing the point of the law. The law is about safety. But the safe thing when there's the fire chasing you is to drive a whole lot faster than 35 miles an hour. So Jesus he's telling these stories for the Pharisees to think a little more deeply. Think about the one where he actually gets the Pharisee to say, the principle, the ground is love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the Pharisees were very concerned with living a pure life. Jesus' dispute with them is that they elevated they elevated the rules above the principles. The Sadducees are the priestly class in Jerusalem. The Essenes these are the people at that site called Qumran, and they retreated entirely from Jewish life. So they in effect said, we believe that the Sadducean leadership in Jerusalem that's taking care of temple sacrifice, we think they are bogus. We think they have obviated their claim to actually be representing God. And they thought, we'll move out to this godforsaken spot and we'll recreate temple worship. So they almost like some kind of post-apocalyptic spaceship story. I mean, they thought, we've got to recreate what the temple was supposed to be right here. So they even did baptismals like they had and still have. You still see them right outside the temple, right off the Temple Mount. So they thought they were in effect replacing temple worship. And then the last kind is the group called the Zealots. And there is one group in particular, a subgroup. I mean, they're not. It's a little like this is maybe not the best analogy, but a little like about mafia movies, and you see the different clans, and they sort of understand each other, but they don't really operate together. So there were various groups that wanted the Romans out, and we call them loosely zealots. But there was one group called the Sicarii, known for their a type of knife they used, and they were famous on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho and back to be hiding in places that were well known for bandits to hide. And they had a knife that it was curved so that if they they came up behind you and they put it right around your throat, they would only need to rotate an inch. And because it was a curved blade that would fit your throat, they would sever all the arteries and just very, very quickly. So that's how they got their name. And they're actually the ones that led the revolt, or that prompted the revolt in 66-70. And you can imagine, think of, what if all of us lived in Syria, and we just happened to live in eastern Syria, and whether we like it or not, somebody in that part of Syria caused, started a violent revolt against the government. And even though we had nothing to do with it, we're involved in this conflict. So that's what it was like for most of the people. A small group in leading up to 66 was violent enough and banditry, etc., that the Romans said, okay, we've got to come in and clean this up. And this is what's actually going on in the cleansing of the temple in the Synoptics, where Jesus says, "You have made my Father's house a den of robbers." Now, the Greek word for robber is kleptes, like kleptomaniac, but that's not the word that's used here. The Greek word that's used here is you made it a den of lace tie. And that is a word which refers precisely to the violent revolutionaries who want to overthrow Roman government. And of course, that's connected to Jesus saying, "This is a house of prayer for all nations." Now, what we do know is that maybe 3 or 4 years before Jesus was crucified, maybe about the time he started his ministry, the Sadducees, to push the Pharisees around, they moved the place where the animals were sold for a sacrifice. They moved it from outside the Temple Mount right up onto the court of the Gentiles, so that nobody could be in the court of the Gentiles. So the court of the Gentiles is for non-Jews to come who are interested in worshiping Yahweh, for them to come and be present. And the effect of all that was to say, Gentiles can't actually be in the court of the Gentiles, because they turned it into this giant, auction yard. And if you spent any time on farms, you know that, animals like that, they're not, you don't really want them in your house very long. It's pretty messy and it's not, you don't really associate it with sobriety of worship. So Saul was a Pharisee.
Hey,
So he was, yes?
Before you go on, why is the verse translated, "You've turned this into a den of thieves" or a den of robbers, if the more appropriate word is revolutionaries?
Yeah, I think it's because that's a traditional sense. So, some of that translation goes way back to the, even the King James. And I think people didn't actually know enough about the difference between kleptes and lace tie until more recently. More recently being like the last 100 years. But one of the things about Bible translation is, we get used to certain language, and certain words are very comforting and familiar. So
Thanks.
So anyway, so for Paul to be a Pharisee means, he was scrupulous about the law, keeping the law. As a Jew, he didn't think keeping the law was how you got in, you're already in, but it's how you express your solidarity, with the community. And of course, if Gentiles want to convert, they need to start observing the law as well in order to be a good Jew. And in this flash of insight, on the Damascus Road, and he thinks about the implications, he realizes that keeping the law, not only does it not get you in, but it doesn't necessarily express anything about your solidarity with God, because from the beginning, as he points out in Romans, Abraham believed God and it was considered to him as righteousness. So he was, in this flash of insight, he came to the same conclusion as some of Jesus' interlocutors did, like the Pharisee who understood that love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and strengthen your neighbor as yourself is the most important commandment. But he came beyond even that to see that considering the law central, whatever else you think about it, blinds people to to the reality that what God desires is a heart that's annealed to Him, and he desires faith. You can follow all the rules and not have any faith, and he came in this flash of insight to see that. So
So David, I have a quick question for you. I've read and heard many times that Jesus and his family, immediate family and extended family, were Essenes. Is that correct?
I would say no, not even close. But because to be an Essene, you would need to have repudiated public life and move to this community. They might have been considered part of the Anawim. I think his even just a study of the names in his family. I mean, they're all they're biblical names, and they are the kind of, and we know. I mean, they weren't actually very common in his day, and so they are. It says something about his family as being, having a tradition of being, rooted in taking seriously their ancestral faith. Now, but Essenes, in order to be an Essene, you would have to move to that community. And from what we know about the Essenes, they didn't practice marriage either. So I mean, it would be, if they were interested in propagating the faith, they may have thought twice about not practicing marriage. But that's what they came up with. And we probably the best evidence is that the site could probably only support, maybe about 100 people. So it wasn't probably a very big group. Now that they had sympathy for the Essenes, or they would have been maybe thinking like that, like wondering about the integrity of the Jerusalem priesthood. That could very well be true.
Well, I have some maps in my NIV version and other versions of the Bible that show the Jerusalem at the time of the Roman Empire, time of Jesus. And it shows the sections of where the different groups lived, and it does show Essenes. So maybe that map is not accurate. I don't know, but.
Well, I think, yeah, I'm going to say it's not accurate.
Okay.
But I mean, it might be.
Yeah, because
I mean, the Essenes were violently opposed to the Jerusalem priesthood, and I mean, just very caustic. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't people who may have been sympathetic. And of course, neighborhoods like today, I mean, they're not necessarily monolithic unless you're really living in some very high-end gated community. So, okay, so what about timeline? So, yeah, Pauline chronology, it's got issues. So the New Testament doesn't actually give us fixed dates, really, but it does provide some historical reference points to events and people that can be compared. And only Luke provides us with any framework at all for dating the life of Paul. I mean, Paul himself doesn't even give us much of a framework. Luke gives us 5 events in Acts that can be dated. So first of all, the death of Herod Agrippa, Acts 12, we know for a fact that took place in 44 AD. And there's the great famine during the reign of Claudius, which was the occasion of Paul's first visit to Jerusalem. That's Acts 11. So we know this took place in AD 46. There's the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. That's mentioned in Acts 18. And Suetonius, the Roman historian, writes of this and it's dated with certainty to 4950 AD. And then there's the mention of this guy Gallio, the governor of Achaia. And this is the most firm of all the dates in Acts. The proconsul of Achaia, and Paul, while he was in Corinth, was brought before him. This is in Acts. And we know that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia from summer of 51 to the summer of 52. So almost certainly Paul arrived in Corinth in early 50 for his 18-month stay. And then Acts also gives us the arrival of Festus, Acts 24 through 25, and that took place in 59 AD. So the issues, number one, no fixed dates. Number two, only Luke provides us with any framework at all. That's what A, B, C, D, and E are. And then the third issue, what about these hidden years of Paul? Jesus was crucified 30 AD. Paul converted, maybe 3 years later, 33. And in Galatians, he says that he first visited Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. Well, that's not the first visit that I just mentioned in the chronology. So this is a different visit. His first visit puts it, let's say, about 36. We still have 10 years between this first and the second visit. So what I'm now calling the second visit here is the visit that sometimes people call the first visit. That is the one mentioned in Acts. So what do we do with what do we do with these 10 years or 36 to 33, maybe 13 years? And then Paul also says that he went up to Jerusalem 14 years later, 14 years after what? So almost certainly he means is 14 years after his conversion, which fits the timeline. Converted somewhere around 33, goes to Jerusalem in 36. But you can see there's room there for people who are trying to reconstruct it all to come up with some slightly different versions. And then there's the question, some people have this used to be a bigger question that people debated. To whom did he write the book Galatians? Was it North Galatia or South Galatia? And almost certainly now it's understood as those cities in the southern part of Galatia. You may remember, I think a map last week I showed a map of the province of Galatia, which is kind of an S shape through what today is Turkey. So that used to be an issue. Did he go to North Galatia or South Galatia? Almost certainly it's South Galatia. Pretty much everybody recognizes that today. And then fifth, he says in Romans 15, I preached the gospel from Jerusalem to Illyricum in a circle. In a circle. Well, Acts doesn't say anything about anything that could look possibly like that. So this is one of the reasons why some people think that Paul, at the end of Acts, he's in Rome. And some people think, well, that was, that's where he was executed. But a lot of people think because of this passage in Romans, that he wasn't executed when he arrived in Rome at the end of Acts, but that he had another couple years of a career as a missionary, and that's where he preached in a circle. But that's still an issue that people are interested in such matters continue to debate. And then there is the problem of the pastorals. When did he write those? When did he write 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus? There's doesn't really fit anywhere in Acts. So I almost certainly wrote them after Acts ends, which is possible. He could have gone to Rome, written them, and then was executed within months of his arrival in Rome. But he also says that he wants to winter in Nicopolis. That's nowhere in the Acts chronology. So the big picture is, yeah, there are some unanswered questions about the chronology. So what I'm going to do now, and this, I'm arriving at this much later than I thought I was going to, but we're going to start just look at the timeline. And I'm sure we'll get through this at least, halfway through next week's session, and then we can talk more about. So we'll have at least 1.5 sessions on the big pictures of Paul's theology. So timeline. Born in Tarsus, about 1 AD. When he was maybe 20, maybe a little younger, but probably for at least 10 years, he goes to Jerusalem and studies with Gamaliel. That'd be like their version of going to Harvard and then Oxford or something. And he becomes a Pharisee. Around 29, 30 to 32, somewhere there, Jesus is crucified. A little bit later, 32, he's present at the stoning of Stephen. Wow, somehow my slide got all messed up as I transferred it. 34, 35, the Damascus Road. Goes to Damascus, meets Ananias, goes to Arabia, and returns to Damascus. As I'm listening to myself, I'm wondering, is this actually helpful to do it this way? Just sort of go through the timeline? Okay. So AD 37. Wow. Okay. So returns to Damascus, maybe still out in the wilderness, but he spends 3 years apart from anywhere, apparently. And that's when he encounters the risen Christ for extended, not for the originally on the Damascus Road, but he will later say that while he's out there for these 3 years, the risen Christ disclosed to him his teaching, that is Jesus' teaching. So returns to Damascus, 34, 35. 37, he came to Jerusalem and had confirmed what he knew and became acquainted with. And that's this, according to the scriptures, way of reading the text. So I need to explain this a little bit. Maybe the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, at least writing in English, was a guy named C.H. Dodd, Charles Harold Dodd. And he wrote a little book, 1948, I think, 52, called According to the Scriptures. And in this book, and by little, I mean it's like 120 pages. And in this book, he pointed out that no matter where you look in the New Testament, the same 15 Old Testament passages come up over and over and over and over and over again. Psalm 2, Psalm 110, Psalm 8, Isaiah 40, Isaiah 52, over and over and over and over and over again. And they're prominent in the early speeches in Acts. If you read Acts 1 and 2, in Acts 1, Peter is still as kind of blockheaded as ever. And then in Acts 2, after the Holy Spirit comes on him, he's suddenly putting together a whole bunch of really complicated Old Testament theology in these very persuasive speeches. But the key to it really is, according to Dodd, is this episode at the end of Luke where the risen Christ encounters the disciples on the Emmaus Road, right? And he says, what's going on? And they're saying, how could you not know? And then they say to Jesus, we heard this. Some of the women in our group are saying they maybe saw him. And then the text says, Jesus opened their minds and told them how according to the scriptures, it was disclosed that the Messiah would have to suffer and die and rise from the dead. Now, of course, there is no Old Testament passage which says the Messiah is going to suffer and die. But Jesus, as we've seen, combines messiahship with Son of Man, and for him, Son of Man is not only Daniel 7; it's also the suffering servant of Isaiah. And so, this notion in Luke that Jesus opened the minds of these two folks to his way of reading the scriptures, and then that got passed on. So what Dodd says is the disciples heard Jesus preach this pattern, because that's what he did. It's pretty clear from the Gospels he's doing that. And that what we have then throughout the New Testament is this way of reading the Old Testament, these 15 Old Testament scriptures that occur over and over and over and over again. And the application here is, when Paul went to Jerusalem, he told the apostles there his understanding of Jesus, and that it fit exactly with their understanding of Jesus, this according to the scriptures way of reading what we call the Old Testament. And that's why Paul can say that he's an apostle, but one untimely born. To be an apostle, you had to have heard Jesus preach and been sent by him. Now, Paul had never heard the earthly Jesus preach, but what the risen Christ disclosed to him, he found out was exactly what the earthly Jesus taught the disciples. That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome if you think about it. And it's this congruence that convinced the earthly disciples that this guy Paul actually did know what was going on, that the risen Christ is still active and disclosing this teaching. So yep, it was perfectly congruent. What the risen Christ taught Paul in those 3 years he's out in the, away from Damascus, was exactly what the earthly Jesus taught his own disciples, which they didn't have the Velcro for it to stick, on them while they were with him. But after he was resurrected, they remembered these things. So that's what happens when he comes to Jerusalem for this visit in 37. He connects with Barnabas. He stays with Peter, visits James, and then there's this attempt on Paul's life. So we're at really the end of our hour. So I want to respect your time. I mean, I could go on a little bit more, but I want to respect your time. Any comments? So next week we'll finish the timeline, and then we'll talk about some of the big the big signposts in Paul's theology. Is that okay? Okay. Any other comments or questions? No? Okay. Life good there in the Bay Area?
Yeah.
Nice weather? Yeah.
90
It's hot. It's hot.
degrees today, yeah.
How much, Randy? Enjoy?
Around 90.
90. Too hot.
Yeah, Walnut Creek can get that. Yeah, you can get that way. It's not that different than here sometimes.
Classic Indian summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the skies are blue. There's no smoke at least not in our skies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
David, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. When I lived in Chicago, I often, had fond memories of life in the Bay Area. Chicago had maybe 6 weeks that were awesome during the year. That was about it.
So you got a lot of opportunity to appreciate the contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what people would say. I remember people saying that. Yeah, that was, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Take the Bay Area over Chicago any day.
Yeah, there are. I love to visit during the right time of the year, but I remember one day walking home. We lived about maybe 400 yards from my office, so it's just walk. And I remember I got about halfway home one day in February, and I thought, I now know why people say, you know what, the smart thing would be just to lie down and die right here in the snow. That'd be the smart thing. It was so cold. The first time the snot froze in my nose, I thought, oh my Lord, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
Well, thank
not
you,
right.
Father. Thank you, Father God, for this day and your love for us. That you are a God of loving kindness, and that you know our frame, and you forgive us, but you also call us home, and that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ dwells within. Father, help us to pay more attention. Help us to expand the place in our heart where you dwell, and maybe see other people with the eyes of Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.